expired. TikTok is used by roughly 170 million Americans and has about 1 billion users worldwide. One of the users of TikTok is President-elect Donald Trump. There are many that credit, at least in part, his win to the young people vote, which was courted at least in part through TikTok. And yet, on January 19th, TikTok will go away, will be banned in the United States if ownership does not change hands before then, and we now involve the Supreme Court. And to help us kind of muddle our way through this conversation, we welcome our next guest this morning. Christopher Green, law professor at the University of Mississippi. Good morning. Thanks for being with us. Was that an even close to accurate summary of where we are with TikTok?
Well, muddled, I think, is a good word for it. I mean, basically, Congress has said this poses, allowing China to have, and the Chinese governmental apparatus to have access to all this information and control of the algorithm that they're using to put videos in front of people's eyeballs is a national security problem. And basically the Supreme Court is going to decide at some point between now and January 19th, but probably the next few weeks, and probably relatively soon, whether to push that deadline back while they decide the case. I think it's relatively likely, I think, that ultimately this law is going to be upheld. But the question for the Supreme Court right now is it sufficiently likely that it will get struck down that they should push the deadline back? Because if on January 19th, they have to change ownership structures, and then the Supreme Court said, oh, never mind, you don't, that would be disruptive and not the way to do it. So I think they will grant a stay. I think it's, just looking at the whole situation, I think the Supreme Court will push the deadline back if they think there's a significant likelihood. And I would think even, I don't know, something north of 10% would be, I think, a reason to maybe push the deadline back. The one thing they could do, they could push the deadline back and then say, okay, but we're going to really hop to it on deciding the case. They're not going to, but. Yeah, so if they deny a stay, I think it's if you're going to deny a stay, you're probably not going to have a full review of the case. That would be a sign that, the D.C. Circuit, the way they dealt with this is fine for now. But there's some complications in how the D.C. Circuit.
So that's where we are, right? The Circuit Court in D.C. said that absent a change in ownership of TikTok, it will be banned in the United States effective January 19th. TikTok versus Merrick Garland in the United States has appealed this decision to the United States Supreme Court, and they are asking SCOTUS to rule on this. I mean, is that where we are?
Yeah, they're asking them to push the deadline back, and so at this point, if you want to play along at home, you can go to the Supreme Court website and just, if you search for Garland, there's two different petitions. So one is from TikTok itself, and another is from some private plaintiffs, some people who want to be able to continue to have TikTok. One thing to remember is all of these videos that are on TikTok, they can just, there's all these imitation brands. So Facebook's got its version of I think Reels. I don't really know much about TikTok, but I know that, these different social media, when something takes off, all the other ones say, we've got our version too. So all of these videos can be put somewhere else where somebody else is in charge of the information and somebody else is doing the algorithm. And those are the national security concerns that Congress had. And both President Trump, so he made some findings in 2019. President Biden made some more findings, and then Congress made some findings. So it's a pretty bipartisan consensus that there are at least some issues here. But the question is,
I was just going to say.
So the question is whether
Professor Green
Americans have the free speech rights to interact with particular foreign entities. So that's really the free speech question.
Yeah. It's fascinating to see the migration from platform to platform, right? So Facebook's got a ton of users, but that's an audience that has trended older over time as younger people have been like, yeah, we don't necessarily want to hang out with all of you in Facebook land. And so they go to Twitter, which becomes X, and then they go to Instagram, and then Snapchat, and then TikTok. And it's like they just continue to move. I don't know that it necessarily accomplishes anything if you say TikTok's out. To your point just a second ago, you just go somewhere else. But maybe
So
maybe leadership's okay with that as long as China doesn't own it.
Yeah. So basically, and they probably could come up with some sort of rejiggering of the ownership structure. There's some factual questions about just how difficult it would be to change it. But remember, they're not suddenly we've got to change our ownership structure. A week before Christmas, they've known. They really since long before the statute. But they've known, Congress is serious about this since last spring, and so they've been, mapping out different parts of the decision tree. But they've clearly got a lot of valuable IP. It's there's a lot of money getting made. You look at the lawyers involved, and there's clearly quite a lot of money being made. And it's it provides information
undefeated
of a sort.
Once again.
It's so the young kids are doing this. I mean, this could be, if it does, shut down TikTok and, give Facebook a new lease on life with the youngins. But it's, so the tradition of allowing restrictions on foreign governments and not foreign governments, but just foreign citizens, subjects of foreign governments, their rights to speak in America have traditionally been subject to all kinds of limits. So in 1791, as they're as the states are discussing the Bill of Rights, actually a couple days ago, December 15th, 1791 is when they got enough states for the Bill of Rights. A few months before that, as they're discussing the bank, Edmund Randolph has this discussion of the Foreign Commerce Clause. So you have Congress has power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And he says that includes the power to let them engage in commerce. They can give them special privileges. You can actually give foreign entities, foreign citizens, foreign subjects more rights than Americans, or you can subject it to whatever limits Congress may think is good policy. So the fact that he's really, really emphatically stating that in 1791 indicates I don't think there's any really super huge First Amendment challenge based on the history. Current doctrine says anytime you make certain kind of distinctions, they have to be justified in certain ways. So there's some question like, okay, because it really specifically names TikTok. There's actually a professor came in and said this is a bill of attainder. So you can't, in America, you can't specifically pass a statute saying person X is guilty of a crime. But there's a whole bunch of cases about when you can name a particular person. So Congress passed a statute saying we want Richard Nixon's tapes. And he said, this is a bill of attainder. You're saying, you're naming me as guilty of a crime. And then they said, well, no, it's a legitimate class of one. So that kind of precedent is something that they'll maybe be thinking about, saying, well, TikTok, it's, if they could have, come up with a category saying all, huge social media platforms with, more than 500 million users or something that has short little silly videos. And, obviously it applies to TikTok. But it is a fairly serious national security issue, I think, going forward. I think the worry is that this kind of cyber stuff could get used and we wouldn't really be aware of it. So if you think of like Hezbollah, they're using these pagers and then like suddenly all their pagers blow up and then they switch to their CBs and all the CBs blow up. because Israel had been more sophisticated in terms of technology.
Yeah.
We don't want something similar like that to happen with, like, for instance, you could have, suddenly promoting,
Can you
putting a
hold that
thumb on
thought
the
for a
scale.
second?
Oh, sure.
You piqued my interest. We're up against a break. If you can hang for just a second, we'll finish that thought on the other side of the timeout. You're listening to the Gallo Radio Show, Super Talk, Mississippi, visiting with Christopher Green, law professor at Ole Miss. We're back right after this. Tuesday morning with you on the Gallo Radio Show. We are past the halfway point in the month of December. Hard to believe. December 17th, just 8 days until Christmas. Christopher Green joining us this morning. Law professor at Ole Miss. We're talking a little bit about TikTok and the Supreme Court's potential hearing of a stay in the date in which they have to transfer ownership or cease to exist in the United States. You were talking about the national security threat before the break, and you referenced the very covert attacks on Hamas with the pagers and the cell phones that Mossad implemented in kind of attacking strategic leaders for Hamas. I talked with law enforcement, intelligence community people who said, look, I'm not saying that this was necessarily the most humane act, but it was one of the most amazing things that has ever happened in the espionage field, like the level of coordination and the precision of those attacks and all that went with it. So I guess that kind of brings at least one question into is, what do you do with all the data, right? The concern is ultimately the Chinese government with access to the data of 170 million Americans who are using the TikTok platform. And then how do they sort through that, and for what do they use? I mean, is it just a stockpile as just in case, or is there an active use for this American user data on TikTok?
Yeah, that's the big question. And so, I mean, we know that China has, they say they own Taiwan and that they're planning to take it back at some point. So, I mean, what would you use TikTok for that? I mean, something like distraction, or to, so one, so like Iran, they were involved in some efforts like this. One of the ideas is, just promoting any video showing Palestinian casualties, just really highlight whether it's fake, whether it's exaggerated, whether it has any context. I mean, kind of almost nothing has any context on TikTok anyway. But if you can have a really, really, really large megaphone for the youth of America, that can impact our ability to wage a war, especially, if you think of the Vietnam War. If the Viet Cong had the ability to directly instigate more youth culture in America, making them even more opposed earlier, they could have maybe won the war earlier. And so youth culture, it's easy to dismiss, easy for old guys like me to dismiss. I think, well, why does it matter what they're doing? But in terms of the distraction level and in terms of like getting information that then the adults pay attention to, it's huge. So the idea that Congress should be concerned about, that megaphone, I think is, I think it's pretty plausible, and I that's why I think it's likely that ultimately TikTok is going to have to change ownership structure.
I heard an interesting commentary on this. It was either this morning or yesterday, and they said, the biggest thing about TikTok is the news feed, and so many youngish people get their news through TikTok. Now, I'm not making any opinions here on legacy media, but I will say that I don't know that TikTok, controlled by the Chinese government, is necessarily the place to get your curated news feed. And the example they used is, when the stuff was going on with Israel and Hamas, you were hard pressed to find pro-Israel videos on TikTok. That was more driven in the direction of all the pro-Hamas, all of the pro-Palestinian, all of the protests that were happening on college campuses, and kind of glorified in the same way that those news feeds could then be curated to the users to show only one side of the story. And I think that is concerning if that's maybe a primary way that a lot of people receive their news.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, a human attention span, I think, is one of the most critical resources going forward. And if you can get a hold of people's attention span, I mean, if you're a marketer, you're trying to sell stuff, oh my goodness, you can make a bundle of money. If you're somebody trying to win a war, again, every time you're fighting a war, you're ultimately trying to get as good a possible negotiation at the end of it. So you're ultimately fighting with the will of a nation. How hard do they want to fight, and for what? And if you can get into the minds of the young people, that's going to be one of the effective levers you can use to try to manipulate those folks to say, hey, Taiwan isn't worth fighting for, Israel isn't worth supporting. Trying to think, even if they make people think for only a few days before the truth comes out, oh my goodness, Israel's committing, war crimes or something. It's, that's a powerful lever. And so I don't think the Supreme Court is likely to want to come in and say, oh yeah, Congress, you don't have that lever. When the facts, I mean, they just don't like to make foreign policy. I think in general, they don't have the competence. I think the findings of fact that Congress made are pretty thorough. So the second guessing of the political branches is pretty unlikely. But it is, it would be a significant change in the social media world, saying that you got to change the ownership structure. But it's, I think, pretty clearly in line with the kind of traditions we've had.
Visiting with Christopher Green for just a couple of more minutes, law professor at Ole Miss. I've heard people say a lot through the years that Twitter, or X now if you prefer, is not real life. In the same way that they say for sports fans, the people who live in message board communities, that's not real life, right? I mean, these are the vocal minority as opposed to the majority. Is that still true when we look at 170 million users on TikTok, 194 million users on Facebook, 100-plus million users on X? Are these platforms becoming more what real life is, or is it still a minority that maybe we're giving too much credit to the megaphone that it has?
It's hard to tell. I mean, for some people, what they do is get on, these platforms. And I mean, you look at some people, like the number of things they'll put on Instagram is like, oh my word. It's like a whole window into your life. And obviously you're spending many hours each day that are not recorded. So it's not, but it can be a pretty large fraction of the interaction you have. I mean, I've really liked kind of the brief back and forth on Twitter in terms of just this debate and discussion about current events. And the curated newsfeed is, it's if you're thinking like, okay, I've only got 15 seconds. What is going on? Okay, having a source for that is useful. Sorry.
It's what's going on that I care about. When
right.
Curated newsfeed.
Yeah. So, and again, the worry is what's going on that I care about, and the Chinese Communist Party wants me to care about, even if it is something I care about, the subset of that foreign folks are doing, or this is why a lot of people have left X for Blue Sky or Threads or whatever the alternative is, because they think, oh no, I don't want to just get a curated thing where it's Elon Musk filtered, because there might be all kinds of stuff that I care about that he wants me not to care about. But he's and again, you have similar sorts of issues about who exactly is in charge of it. But you do get these mass migrations. So if people don't like it, they can sure. almost always go somewhere else. It's build yourself your own social network is surprisingly good as a response, given that there are just a lot of zeros on the money to be made. And if there are a bunch of existing social media platforms that can kind of add this kind of thing as an add-on. But yeah, how much of the world is online? I don't know.
Yeah, it certainly is a number that is growing. Christopher Green, law professor at Ole Miss. You are well traveled in your academic past, including a graduate degree from Notre Dame. How closely are you watching Indiana Notre Dame on Friday night.
Oh yeah, well we're traveling for the holidays. We're gonna hopefully get ensconced in Chicago by 7 p.m. to watch that. So we'll I don't know if we'll be close enough to South Bend to hear the shouts, but it's possible. So it's fun to have home games for these playoffs.
No doubt.
I think the more the better.
No doubt. Waking up the echoes on a Friday night instead of a Saturday. Christopher Green, law professor at Ole Miss, thanks so much for your time this morning. Always an interesting conversation. Look forward to visiting with you in the future.
Good talking to you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you as well. This is the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi. Half an hour left with you on this Tuesday morning. We'll let you hear a little bit more of what President-elect Trump had to say, and also Mitt Romney had some interesting things to say in a conversation with Jake Tapper over the weekend. That's coming up. This is the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi.